The harvest moon hung low over the Missouri bottoms like a bruised lantern, its orange glow seeping through the cracks in the Drownworth cabin's walls. Elias Drownworth wiped sweat from his brow with a calloused hand, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and ripening corn. It was September 1856, and the fields stretched endless under that moon, whispering promises of a bountiful yield, if the rains held off just a little longer. He leaned on his hoe, glancing back at the squat log house that had been his anchor since he claimed this land a decade ago. Sturdy as it looked, with its chinked walls and sagging porch, Elias knew better than to trust appearances come full moon. Inside, his wife Clara knelt by the hearth, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, but stray wisps clung to her neck in the humid warmth. She was the steady one, the one who'd followed him from Ohio with their 2 young ones, trading city comforts for this frontier scrape. "Elias," she called without looking up, her voice even but edged with that familiar caution. "You planning to sleep out there with the scarecrows again?" She ladled the mush into bowls, the steam curling like ghosts in the firelight. Elias stepped through the door, boots thudding on the packed dirt floor. "Just checking the levee. River's high this year. Feels wrong, like it's itching to spill over." He hung his hat on a peg, eyes flicking to the children huddled at the rough-hewn table. Young Thomas, 8 and all gangly limbs, poked at his bowl with a wooden spoon, his freckled face serious beyond his years. Beside him, little Mary, 5, swung her legs, humming a tune about riverboats she'd heard from passing traders. They were the heart of it all, these 2, reminders of why he'd fought the mud and the fevers to build this life. Thomas looked up, spoon paused midair. "Pa, will the flood come again? Like Gran said it did before we were born?" His voice was small, but there was a spark in his eyes, the kind that came from stories told too late at night. Clara shot Elias a glance, sharp as a switch. She didn't hold with old tales, not the ones about cursed ground or houses that wept water under the moon. "Eat your supper, Tom. Your Gran spun yarns to keep you from wandering off." But Elias saw the flicker in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed. Last harvest, the basement had pooled with inches of water overnight, seeping up from the foundation like sweat from a fevered man. They'd blamed a spring thaw, mopped it dry by dawn. The year before that, it had been worse. Rugs sodden, tools rusted. No rain, no breach in the banks. Just the moon, full and watchful. Elias ruffled Thomas's hair as he sat, pulling his own bowl close. "Ground's thirsty after a dry summer. Happens sometimes." He didn't meet Clara's eyes, but he felt her scrutiny. They'd argued about selling the place last spring, after the water ruined half their stores. She wanted to head west, to Kansas, where the land didn't fight back. He couldn't. This was his claim, his blood in the soil. As they ate in the fire's glow, the cabin creaked softly, settling into the night. Outside, the river murmured beyond the corn, a low rumble that blended with the cicada's chorus. Mary yawned, her humming fading, and Clara gathered the bowls, her movements precise. "Bed now, both of you. Moon's up, means early rising tomorrow." Elias lingered by the window after the children scampered to their loft, watching the fields silver under the lunar light. The levee he'd patched that afternoon held firm, a low berm of mud and woven branches. But as the moon climbed, a chill prickled his skin, unseasonal and deep. He thought of his father-in-law's warnings before they left Ohio. Some places remember their drownings, pull the water back to settle old scores. Fool talk, Elias told himself, turning away. Yet when he blew out the lantern, the darkness pressed close, and he swore he heard a faint slosh, like boots in shallow puddles, just beyond the walls. Elias Drownworth wiped the sweat from his brow, the late summer sun baking the Missouri soil into cracked earth that stretched like old leather toward the river. He paused at the edge of the cornfield, hoe balanced on his shoulder, and squinted at the horizon where the Mississippi coiled like a serpent. It was August, still, but the air carried that faint chill, the whisper of harvest moon's approach. Every year it came, that moon, fat and yellow, pulling at the waters as if the river itself hungered for their home. Inside the cabin, Martha knelt by the hearth, her hand steady as she stirred the pot of beans. Her dark hair, streaked with early gray, was pinned back, but a few strands escaped, framing eyes that held a quiet resolve. "Elias'll be in soon," she said to the children, her voice even, though her fingers tightened on the wooden spoon. Little Amos, 7 and wiry, fidgeted with a whittled stick, while Clara, 10, sat cross-legged on the floor, mending a tear in her brother's shirt. The cabin was sturdy, logs chinked with clay, roof thatched tight, but Martha's gaze drifted to the warped floorboards near the back wall, where last year's high water had left faint stains like bruises. Amos looked up, his freckled face earnest. "Pa says the river's low this year. Maybe it won't come." He poked at the stick, imagining it a sword against invisible foes. Clara snorted softly, her needle pausing. "Pa says that every year, and it still comes. Remember the mud in our beds?" She didn't look at him, but her shoulders tensed, the memory clinging like damp cloth. Martha set the spoon down, the clink echoing in the small space. "Hush now. We prepare, same as always." Sandbags by the door, shutters latched. But as she spoke, a shadow passed over her face, not fear, exactly, but the weight of knowing. The flooding wasn't natural, not like the spring melts. It waited for the harvest moon, rising slow and deliberate, seeping through the ground before the rains even fell. Folks in town whispered of curses, old Indian spirits roused by the white man's plows, but Martha pushed such talk aside. Superstition wouldn't stack the sandbags or reinforce the sills. Outside, Elias shouldered the hoe and trudged back, his boots kicking up dust that hung in the air like ghosts. He was a broad man, calloused hands from years tilling this stubborn land, but caution marked him, always checking the levee, always one eye on the water. As he neared the cabin, a low rumble carried from the river, not thunder, but something deeper, like the earth shifting in its sleep. He stopped, listening, the sound fading into the cicada's hum. That night, as the family gathered around the table, the stew steaming between them, Elias broke the silence. "River's murmuring again. Felt it in the ground today." His voice was low, matter of fact, but his fork paused midway to his mouth. Martha met his eyes across the scarred wood. "We start tomorrow. Amos, you'll help with the smaller bags. Clara, the loft needs clearing. Anything low goes up high." Amos nodded vigorously, eager to prove himself, but Clara's face paled, her spoon scraping the bowl. "What if it's worse this time? The water, it feels alive sometimes, pushing at the walls." Elias reached over, squeezing her hand. "It ain't alive, girl. Just water. We hold it back, like always." But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his chest, a cold thread winding tighter. The floods had grown hungrier over the years, claiming more than just the fields. Last season, Old Man Hargrove's barn had vanished overnight, swallowed whole, leaving only ripples in the dawn light. As the children cleared the table, Martha stepped outside to the porch, the night air thick with the scent of drying corn. The moon wasn't full yet, but its pull was there, tugging at her like an unseen current. She wrapped her shawl tighter, staring at the dark line of the river, where fireflies danced erratic over the surface. Something stirred in the depths, a shadow longer than the reeds, and for a moment, she swore she heard whispers, faint and wet, calling from the water's edge. Inside, Elias banked the fire, the embers glowing like wary eyes. He didn't sleep easy that night, the cabin creaking as if settling into uneasy dreams. By morning, the first signs appeared, a thin film of moisture on the back wall, beading like sweat on fevered skin, though no rain had fallen. Elias gripped the lantern tighter as the water lapped at the floorboards, its chill seeping through his boots like a persistent whisper. The harvest moon hung bloated outside the window, casting silvery streaks across the parlor where the family had gathered. Ma had her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes darting to the corners as if the shadows might stir. Little Timmy clutched his wooden horse, the one Pa had carved before the fevers took him, his small face pale but set with that stubborn fire Elias envied. "It's comin' again," Ma murmured, her voice barely above the rising slosh. She knelt by the hearth, stuffing rags into the cracks where the floor met the wall, but the water ignored them, pooling around her knees. Elias watched it spread, dark and oily under the lantern's glow, carrying flecks of what might have been leaves, or something finer, like silt from a grave. He stepped forward, boots squelching, and pressed his shoulder against the doorframe. "We can't just wait this time, Ma. Last year it took the root cellar. This one's meaner." His words hung heavy, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, like rust from old nails. Timmy looked up, eyes wide. "Is it the river, Eli? Or the monster Pa talked about?" Ma shot him a sharp glance, but Elias shook his head. No use lying now. The floods came with the moon, every harvest, turning their sturdy cabin into a sinking boat. Folks in town whispered of curses, of the drowned Worth name tied to some old sin by the bend in the Mississippi. But Elias knew better. He'd seen the water retreat at dawn, leaving behind not just mud, but echoes, faint scratches on the walls, like fingers clawing from below. A low groan echoed from the foundation, vibrating up through the planks. The lantern flickered, and for a heartbeat, the water's surface rippled as if breathed upon. Elias's heart thudded. He grabbed the iron poker from the fire, its tip still warm. "Stay close," he told them, voice steady despite the knot in his gut. Ma nodded, pulling Timmy to her side, but her hands trembled as she reached for the family Bible, its pages warped from years of such nights. Outside, the wind howled through the cottonwoods, bending them like supplicants. Elias peered through the glass, the moon's light turning the yard into a ghostly sea. Something moved at the edge of the treeline, a shape, indistinct, sloshing through the rising tide. Not an animal, too deliberate. He swallowed hard, the poker heavy in his fist. This flood wasn't just water, it hungered, pulling at the house like a living thing, testing the beams that held their world together. Timmy whimpered, and Ma hushed him, but Elias turned back, resolve hardening. "We fight it tonight. No runnin'." The water climbed another inch, cold fingers brushing his ankle, and in its depths, he swore he saw a glint, not moonlight, but eyes watching. Elias gripped the lantern's handle tighter, the flame inside flickering like a heartbeat against the damp chill seeping through the floorboards. The water had risen again overnight, silent as a thief, lapping at the edges of the kitchen table where the family had gathered. It was the third harvest moon in a row, and this time, the flood carried whispers, faint, bubbling sounds from below that mimicked half-formed words. Ma had heard them first, her face paling as she stirred the pot of thin stew, pretending it was just the creek overflowing from the rains. But Elias knew better. At 14, he saw the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she portioned out the meal. "Pass the bread, boy," Pa said, his voice rough as gravel, though he sat with his boots still on, as if ready to wade out at any moment. The water swirled around his chair legs, cold and insistent, carrying flecks of mud from the river that shouldn't have reached this far inland. Pa was the cautious one, always mending the levees himself, but this year the barriers held no sway. The harvest moon hung bloated outside the window, its light turning the floodwater silver, like spilled mercury. Elias slid the loaf across the table, careful not to dip it. Little Sarah, his sister, huddled in her shawl, her bare feet dangling above the surface. She was 8, all wide eyes and quick questions, but tonight she was quiet, tracing patterns in the water with a spoon. "It feels warmer than last time," she murmured, not looking up. Elias shot her a warning glance. "Don't stir it, not like that." But she only dipped deeper, and for a second, the whispers grew clearer, a susurrus of names that sounded too much like their own. Ma set the bowls down with a clatter, the stew steaming faintly. "Eat while it's hot. Won't be long before we have to move the beds again." Her words were steady, but her gaze darted to the trapdoor in the corner, the one leading to the root cellar. It was swollen shut now, the wood bulging against the pressure below. Last moon, they'd pried it open to find the cellar half full, shelves overturned, jars of preserves shattered like brittle bones. Nothing had been taken, but things had been left, strange, smooth stones that gleamed unnaturally, as if polished by hands unseen. Pa slurped his stew, then pushed the bowl away half-eaten. Rivers rising faster. Heard from the miller yesterday, says the whole valley's complaining of leaks in their foundations. But ours, it's like the ground's breathing it up. He rubbed his beard, streaked with gray earlier than his 40 years should allow. Elias watched his father's knuckles whiten on the table's edge. Pa wasn't one for tales, but the weight of unspoken dread pressed on him like the water itself. A low gurgle echoed from under the house, vibrating through the planks. Sarah dropped her spoon, and it vanished into the flood with a plink. "Did you hear that?" it said, Sarah. Her voice cracked, small and sharp in the dim room. Ma reached for her, pulling her close, but Elias stood, the chair scraping back. He couldn't sit there anymore, listening to the house groan like a living thing. Grabbing the lantern, he moved to the window, peering out at the moon's glow on the endless ripples. The fields beyond were submerged, cornstalks bowing like drowned soldiers, and in the distance, the river bent unnaturally, as if curving toward their doorstep with intent. "Stay put," Pa warned, but Elias was already unlatching the door, the hinges protesting. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and something sharper, like decay masked by rain. He stepped onto the porch, water sloshing over his boots immediately, the lantern casting long shadows that danced on the surface. The flood wasn't just rising, it was probing, tendrils of current snaking toward the house's corners, testing the sills. He remembered the old tales from Granny, whispered before she passed, how the land here swallowed settlers whole, jealous of those who tilled it. But Pa called it nonsense, blamed the spring thaws and poor drainage. Inside, Ma's voice rose, muffled. "Elias, get back. The whispers are getting louder." He turned, but a ripple caught his eye. Something dark bobbed just beyond the steps, not debris, but a shape, elongated and pale, like a limb caught in the flow. His heart thudded, the lantern swinging wild. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the water lapped higher, now kissing the porch edge. Sarah's cry pierced the night from within. Elias bolted back, slamming the door against the surge. The family clustered together as the whispers swelled, a chorus now, murmuring promises of depths and forgotten kin. Paul lit another lantern, his face set in grim resolve. "We'll reinforce the doors at dawn. Tie the furniture high." But Elias saw the lie in his eyes. The flood wasn't leaving at dawn this time. It lingered, patient, waiting for the moon to pull it higher still. Elias gripped the splintered banister as the water surged higher, lapping at the second-floor landing like a living thing testing its boundaries. The harvest moon hung bloated in the sky outside the cracked window, its light fracturing through the ripples below. He could hear Ma's labored breaths from the bedroom down the hall, where she'd barricaded herself with the last of the furniture. Pa was gone, swept away 2 moons back, his cries echoing until they didn't. Now it was just him, little Sarah clinging to his leg, and the relentless flood that came like clockwork, hungry for what was left. "Sarah, stay close," Elias whispered, his voice rough from shouting orders to no one. She nodded, her wide eyes reflecting the moon's glow, but her small hand trembled in his. At 12, she was all sharp angles and quiet defiance, the one who'd first noticed the patterns in the floods, not every storm, but every harvest moon, rising from the creek bed as if the earth itself wept blood. They'd laughed it off at first, blaming the bend in the river, but laughter died when the waters didn't recede for days, carrying off livestock and leaving silt that stank of rot. He edged toward the bedroom door, the floorboards groaning under the weight of the intrusion. The water was cold, seeping through his boots, numbing his toes. Something brushed against his ankle. A fish? Debris? He kicked it away, heart pounding. Last moon, he'd seen shapes in the depths, pale and elongated, watching from the murk. Not animals. Not natural. Inside the room, Ma sat on the bed, her skirts hiked up, a lantern flickering in her lap. Her face was gaunt, etched with lines that hadn't been there a year ago, but her eyes burned with that stubborn fire. "Elias, the trapdoor," she said, not looking up from the knife she was sharpening against a whetstone. It was her idea, that hidden hatch in the attic they'd pried open last time, leading to the crawlspace above the eaves. But the waters had risen faster this moon, blocking the ladder before they could climb. "It's underwater now, Ma. Up to my knees." He pulled Sarah onto the bed beside her, the girl's teeth chattering. The room smelled of damp wood and the herbal poultice Ma had smeared on the walls, some old remedy from her grandmother, meant to ward off the river's spite. It hadn't worked before. A low rumble shook the house, like thunder trapped in the foundation. The water level crept up another inch, bubbling through the floor cracks. Sarah whimpered, burying her face in Ma's side. "It knows we're here," she murmured, voice muffled. Elias shot her a look. "Don't say that." But he felt it too, that unnatural pull, as if the flood whispered invitations. "We wait it out," Ma decided, snapping the knife shut. "Like always. Come dawn, it'll ebb." But her hands shook as she set the lantern on the windowsill. Elias nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. Last time, the ebb had left behind a boot that wasn't theirs, caked in mud from upstream miles away, and whispers in the night calling names. He peered out the window, the moon's face mocking him through the sheeting rain. The creek had swollen into a beast, swallowing the front porch whole. In the distance, the neighbors' lanterns bobbed like fireflies fleeing. Everyone knew to head for high ground when the moon ripened. But the Drownsworth place was cursed, or so the town said, built on that old burial mound Pa had cleared for farmland. Elias had dismissed the talk until the flood started claiming more than land. A splash from below jerked him back. Something heavy thudded against the stairs, rhythmic, like footsteps in the shallows. Sarah sat up, clutching the quilt. "It's coming up." Elias grabbed the axe from beside the door, its handle slick with sweat. "Stay put." He stepped into the hall, the water now swirling at mid-thigh, dark and opaque. The lantern's light barely pierced it, casting long shadows that danced like specters. He swung the beam low, searching for the source of the noise. There, a ripple, deliberate, circling the banister. Then a hand broke the surface, pale and webbed, fingers curling toward the wood. Not a hand. Too long, too thin. Elias's breath caught as it grasped the rail, pulling up a form that defied the light. Elongated limbs, skin mottled like river clay, eyes gleaming with moonlight's reflection. It wasn't human, but it wore the shape of one, a mockery risen from the depths. He swung the axe down, the blade biting into the banister with a crack that echoed. The thing recoiled, sinking back with a hiss that bubbled through the water. But more ripples spread, converging. The house shuddered again, harder this time, as if the flood sought to drag them under. "Elias!" Ma's voice cut through, sharp with fear. He turned, splashing back to the room, axe dripping. Sarah was at the window, pointing. Outside, the water had breached the upper yard, tendrils licking at the glass. And in the moon's glow, indistinct figures moved in the current, dozens, silent and purposeful. "We can't stay," he said, hauling the bed frame toward the door. "The attic. We'll swim for it." Ma hesitated, then nodded, grabbing Sarah's hand. As they waded out, the waters rose to meet them, cold fingers brushing their legs. The things below stirred, their whispers growing into a chorus, calling the family by name. Elias led the way, axe raised, praying the dawn would come before the flood claimed its due. But deep down, he knew Elias Drownworth wiped the sweat from his brow, the lantern's flicker casting long shadows across the attic beams. The harvest moon hung fat and unyielding outside the small, grimy window, its light seeping through like an unwelcome guest. Below, the creek that bordered their Missouri farm had swollen unnaturally, whispering against the foundation with a persistence that set his teeth on edge. It was the 6th harvest in a row, and each time the water rose higher, as if the land itself remembered some old grudge. His wife, Clara, knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she tied knots in a makeshift barrier of burlap sacks stuffed with sand and corn cobs. Her face, lined from years of toil, held that quiet resolve he'd fallen for back in '49, but tonight her eyes darted to the floorboards, where faint creaks echoed like distant footsteps. "We reinforced the sills this spring, Elias," she murmured, her voice steady but laced with the strain of holding back fear. "The preacher said it was just a curse we could pray away. But this feels different." Their son, young Harlan, barely 14, hammered nails into a plank with furious swings, his wiry frame taut as a bowstring. The boy had always been the cautious one, the one who mapped their fields twice over before planting, but tonight his caution twisted into something sharper. "Pa, the water's already lapping at the back door. If we don't get these braces up, it'll be like last year, everything's swept clean." He paused, hammer midair, glancing at his little sister, Mira, who huddled in the corner clutching a rag doll soaked from an earlier mishap. At 10, she was the brave spark, the one who'd wade into the shallows to fetch stray eggs, but now her wide eyes reflected the moon's glow, unblinking. Elias nodded, forcing a grim smile. "We'll hold it this time. The trench we dug last week should divert it." But even as he spoke, a low gurgle rose from below, like the house drawing breath. He descended the ladder first, boots thudding on the stairs, the air growing thicker, cooler, with each step. The parlor, once their sturdy heart, now smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like blood under rain. Water seeped through the floor cracks in thin veins, pooling around the legs of the oak table where they'd shared suppers and stories. Clara followed, her skirt brushing the rising film. "Harlan, Mira, stay close." They gathered at the threshold, peering into the night. The creek, no more than a lazy ribbon in daylight, had become a serpent, coiling black against the porch. Elias had spent days carving that trench, a shallow gash from the bank to a dry gulch a quarter-mile off, lined with stones to guide the flood away. It was their best plan yet, born of desperation after last harvest's ruin. The barn half-submerged, livestock lost, and Myra's fever from the chill that followed. But as the moon crested, the water didn't veer. It surged, ignoring the trench like it was a mere scratch on the earth. Elias's stomach knotted. "No," he whispered, stepping out onto the porch. The wood groaned under his weight, slick with mist. Harlan grabbed a lantern and thrust it forward, illuminating the flow. The trench filled, then overflowed, the current twisting back toward the house, as if pulled by invisible hands.
"Pa."
It's coming from under." Clara pulled Mira back inside, her arms a shield. "The root cellar, check the pump again." But Elias was already moving, splashing through the inch-deep puddle forming at the steps. He yanked open the cellar door, the hinges screeching in protest. Darkness yawned below, and with it, a rush of cold air that carried the scent of rot, older than the floods, deeper, like the breath of something buried alive. Harlan joined him, lantern swinging, casting wild shadows on the stone walls. The pump, their last hope, a hand-cranked beast they'd bartered for in town, sat idle in knee-deep water. Elias seized the handle and cranked, muscles burning, but the water only bubbled up faster, mocking their efforts. A shape flickered in the depths, not debris, but a pale hand, or the illusion of one, reaching briefly before the current swallowed it. Harlan gasped, stumbling back. "Did you see?" "Nothing," Elias snapped, though his voice cracked. He couldn't afford doubt, not with the walls trembling now, the house shuddering as the flood clawed higher. Upstairs, Clara's shout cut through. "It's in the kitchen." "Mira, up the stairs." They bolted up, water chasing their heels, the lantern sputtering as droplets hissed against the flame. The family huddled in the attic once more, the barrier of sacks already sodden and sagging. Outside, the moon watched impassively, and the water rose, carrying whispers that sounded almost like names. Drownsworth, Drownsworth, echoing from the depths they'd never fully plumbed. Elias pressed his back to the beam, heart pounding. The plan had failed, spectacularly, And now the house held them like a sinking ship, the night stretching endless before dawn's uncertain mercy. Elias gripped the splintered banister as the water surged higher, lapping at the second-floor landing like a living thing with teeth. The harvest moon hung bloated outside the shattered window, its light fracturing through the ripples below, turning the flood into a mosaic of silver knives. He'd lost track of how many times this had happened. Every autumn, the river would swell unnaturally, ignoring the rains that hadn't come, seeping through the floorboards as if the house itself wept blood. But this time, the whispers from the depths sounded different, closer, like voices calling his name.
Pa.
It's rising faster. Myra's voice cut through the roar, sharp and steady despite the fear etching her young face. At 14, she was all wiry determination, her dark hair plastered to her forehead as she hauled a soaked quilt toward the attic stairs. She never cried during these nights, not like little Tom, who huddled in the corner clutching his wooden horse, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. Elias nodded, his calloused hands aching from prying loose the last of the floorboards downstairs. Keep moving, girl. We get to the roof if we have to. He glanced at Sarah, his wife, who knelt by the window, her skirts heavy with water as she knotted a rope to the sill. Her eyes, once bright with the promise of their homestead, now held a quiet resolve, the kind that had kept them alive through lean winters and fevers. But tonight, that resolve flickered. She'd seen the shadows in the water earlier, shapes that twisted against the current, not debris, but something deliberate. The house groaned, a deep timber crack echoing from below, and the floor tilted sharply. Tom yelped, sliding toward the edge where the banister had given way. Mira lunged, grabbing his arm just as Elias dove across the slick wood, his boots skidding. They pulled the boy back together, Tom's small body trembling against Elias's chest. "It's the river devil," Tom whimpered, his voice muffled. "He wants us this time." "Hush that," Sarah snapped, though her hands shook as she tested the rope's knot. "Ain't no devils, just the flood. We've bested it before." But her words hung hollow. Last moon, they'd found the neighbor's dog floating belly up, its eyes wide and empty, and old man Hargrove's lantern bobbing, unmanned downriver. The whispers had started then, faint at first, murmuring of debts unpaid, of the land's old hunger. Water crested the landing now, cold as grave soil, swirling around their ankles. Elias felt it tug at him, insistent, like fingers brushing his calves. He shook it off, hefting the satchel of provisions, dried corn, a flint, the family Bible, over his shoulder. "Rope's our way out. Mira, you first with Tom. Sarah, you follow. I'll hold the end." Mira tied the rope around her waist, then Tom's, her movements precise despite the chaos. What if the roof don't hold? The wind's picking up. Outside, the oaks bent low, branches clawing the sky, and the moon's glow pulsed, as if breathing. "It'll hold," Elias said, forcing certainty into his voice. He was the brave one, the one who'd felled the trees for this very house, but doubt gnawed at him now. The flood wasn't just water. It carried echoes of something older, stirred by the moon's pull. Last year, it had taken their cow, dragging it under without a ripple. This year, the whispers promised more. They moved single file, the rope taut between them, inching up the narrow attic stairs as the deluge roared below. Tom whimpered with each step, but Mira coaxed him forward, her free hand steady on his back. Sarah paused midway, glancing down into the abyss, where their parlor furniture bobbed like drowned specters. "Elias," she murmured, "I hear it again."
I thought.
He pulled her up beside him, the water nipping at their heels. "Don't listen. It's the wind, the waves. Nothing more." But as they reached the attic door, a low chant rose from the flood. Names, their names, woven into the rush. The door stuck, warped by years of damp, and Elias threw his weight against it, shoulder burning. It gave with a splintering crack, spilling them into the dim space under the rafters. The attic was a crammed tomb of forgotten things, trunks of yellowed linens, rusted tools, Myra's old doll staring sightless from a shelf. Moonlight slanted through a gable vent, illuminating dust motes that danced like lost souls. They untied the ropes, collapsing against the walls as the house shuddered violently. Below, a crash, perhaps the kitchen wall buckling, and the water's level climbed audibly, a hungry slurp. "We wait for dawn," Elias said, his voice rough. "Moon sets, it recedes. Always has." He pulled Tom close, the boy's shivers easing slightly in the warmth of his father's coat. Sarah lit the lantern with trembling fingers, its flame casting long shadows that seemed to writhe. "But what if it don't this time? The whispers, they know our sins, Elias. The land we took from the river folk, the promises we broke." Her words were soft, but they landed like stones, stirring memories of the Osage tales Hargrove had scoffed at, of waters that remembered grudges. Mira crossed to the vent, peering out. The river had swallowed the yard, the barn a dark silhouette half-submerged. "Look," she breathed. In the moon's glow, ripples converged unnaturally, forming a shape, a hand, vast and pale. Reaching from the Elias gripped the splintered beam overhead, his knuckles white against the sodden wood, as the water rose another inch in the parlor. It was past midnight now, the harvest moon a bloated eye glaring through the cracked window panes, casting silvery ripples across the flooded floorboards. His wife, Clara, huddled on the makeshift raft they'd lashed together from the dining table and chair legs, her skirts heavy with muck, whispering prayers that dissolved into the lap of the unnatural tide. The children, young Tom and little Mira, clung to her sides, their faces pale smudges in the dim light, too exhausted to cry anymore. The flood had come again, just as it did every year since they'd settled this cursed plot of land, but this time it felt different, hungrier, as if the river beyond the levee had grown teeth. Elias had reinforced the doors with every scrap of iron he could scavenge from the barn, swearing this harvest would be the last they'd face it trapped like rats. But the water ignored his barricades, seeping up from the ground itself, cold and insistent, carrying the faint rot of things long buried. "Pa," Tom murmured, his voice a thin thread, "it's pulling at my feet again." The boy shifted on the raft, kicking at the dark shapes swirling below. Fish, or worse, Elias couldn't tell. He'd seen them last year, silver-scaled things with eyes like polished stones, darting too close to the surface. "Hold still," Elias grunted, hauling himself higher on the beam as the water lapped at his boots. His arms burned from the effort, but dropping down meant joining the current that now swirled knee-deep around the room's edges. Clara met his gaze, her eyes hollowed by fear, and he saw the question she wouldn't voice. Why here? Why us? The farm had seemed a godsend when they bought it cheap from Old Man Harrow, who fled without explanation, but now Elias wondered if the soil itself remembered some ancient wrong. A low groan echoed from the walls, like the house settling into its grave, and the water surged, bubbling up from the hearth as if the chimney wept black ichor. Mira whimpered, burying her face in Clara's damp apron. Elias scanned the room, his mind racing for way out. The attic ladder was useless now, half submerged, and the back stairs led to the kitchen where the flood had already claimed the stove, twisting metal like paper. They'd tried the front door earlier, but it held fast, swollen shut by the rising damp, as if the house refused to let them go. "Clara, the window," he said, nodding toward the one facing the moonlit fields. It was narrow, framed by vines that had withered overnight, but perhaps they could pry it open. She nodded, her jaw set, and began inching the raft toward it with a broken broom handle, the children studying each other as the platform bobbed unsteadily. The water deepened, carrying debris from deeper in the house, a child's wooden horse, bobbing like a drowned soldier, pages from the family Bible, ink bleeding into illegible curses. Elias dropped from the beam, landing with a splash that sent cold fingers up his trousers. He waded to the window, the current tugging at his legs like insistent hands, and wedged his knife into the sill. Wood splintered under the blade, but the frame resisted, warped by years of this seasonal torment. From outside came a distant rumble, not thunder, but something earthier, like the ground shifting in its sleep. Tom pointed, his finger trembling. Look, Pa. The river's, it's moving wrong. Through the glass, Elias glimpsed the Missouri's dark ribbon beyond the yard, no longer flowing south but coiling inward, toward their doorstep, as if drawn by the moon's pull. Clara's voice cut through the murk, sharp with urgency. It's giving. Push harder. Elias threw his shoulder against the pane, and with a crack like breaking bone, the window shattered outward. Shards rained into the flood, and fresh air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and decay. But as the raft bumped against the sill, a shadow stirred in the water below the opening, long and sinuous, circling closer. Go! Elias barked, lifting Mira first, her small body light in his arms despite the chill seeping into her bones. Clara followed, hoisting Tom up behind her, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Elias was last, scrambling over the ledge as the water boiled beneath him, something brushing his ankle with a slick, deliberate touch. They tumbled into the yard, the flood spilling out after them in a foaming cascade, soaking the trampled corn stalks. The house loomed behind, its windows like empty sockets, and the moon hung low, indifferent. But as they staggered toward the treeline, Elias glanced back and saw the water receding, not draining away, but retreating into the walls, leaving behind a trail of mud that pulsed faintly, as if alive. Clara pulled Mira close, her voice a fierce whisper. We can't stay. Not another moon. Elias nodded, the weight of it settling in his chest like river stones. The farm was lost, but so was their chance to flee before dawn broke and the world pretended normalcy. In the distance, the rumble grew, and Elias knew the true flood hadn't ended. It had only begun to chase them. Elias gripped the splintered banister, his knuckles white against the wood that had warped from years of damp. The water lapped at the second-floor landing now, cold and insistent, carrying the faint rot of earth turned over too many times. Below, the lantern's flame danced erratically on the parlor ceiling, casting shadows that twisted like roots seeking purchase. He could hear Ma's voice from the attic stairs, sharp but steady, urging the children higher. Keep moving, Lottie. One step at a time. Her words cut through the slosh of rising flood, but Elias knew the strain in them. The harvest moon hung full outside the cracked window, its light silvering the waves that shouldn't be there, not this deep inside the house, not without the river breaking its banks miles away. He'd tried sealing the doors again that evening, just like last year, pounding nails into the frames with hands that remembered the rhythm from childhood. But the water had seeped in anyway, silent at first, pooling in the corners like spilled ink. Now it roared, or maybe that was just the house groaning under the weight. Pa had always said it was the land's curse, the way the old creek bed under the foundation woke with the moon. Elias had laughed it off once, called it tall tales to scare the young ones. Not anymore. A thud from below pulled him back. The front door buckled inward, not from force but from the pressure building behind it, as if the flood were breathing. He leaned over the railing, peering down. The parlor furniture floated like derelict boats, the rocking chair he'd carved for Lottie's birth, the table scarred from family suppers. And there, bobbing against the stairs, was the trapdoor to the cellar, pried loose again. It shouldn't have been. He'd nailed it shut weeks ago. Elias. Ma's call sharpened. She appeared at the top of the attic ladder, her apron sodden, little Ben clinging to her skirts. Lottie trailed behind, her face pale, clutching the rag doll that had survived 3 floods already. The roof's holding, but the walls, they're weeping something fierce up here. He nodded, forcing his voice even. I'll check the back. Maybe reinforce the kitchen door. It was a lie, half-formed. The kitchen was underwater to the sills, the stove adrift. But saying it aloud steadied him, gave the illusion of control. He descended the stairs carefully, the wood creaking under his boots, each step sending ripples outward. The water reached his shins now, tugging at his trousers like insistent fingers. Cold seeped through the leather, numbing his calves. He waded toward the hallway, the lantern hooked on his belt swaying, throwing light on the wallpaper peeling in strips, faded roses that looked like eyes watching. Something brushed his leg, soft and yielding. He froze, heart thudding. A drowned rat? Or worse, one of the things that surfaced in the stories Pa whispered before the fever took him. Shapes in the water, remnants of the drowned who'd built this house on cursed ground. He shook it off, pushed forward. The kitchen door hung ajar, water pouring through the gap in a steady sheet. Beyond, the moon's glow filtered through the window, illuminating the yard where the corn stood half-submerged, stalks bending like supplicants. Elias grabbed a loose plank from the wall, wedged it against the doorframe. Useless, probably, but the act grounded him. Sweat beaded on his brow, despite the chill. From the parlor, a splash, louder, deliberate. He spun, lantern raised. The water's surface broke, and for a heartbeat, he saw it. Not debris, but a hand, pale and elongated, grasping at the floating chair. It vanished as quickly, leaving only ripples. His breath caught. "Who's there?" The words echoed foolishly in the empty space. No answer, just the relentless rise. He backed toward the stairs, the plank forgotten. Up above, Ma's voice called again, fainter now, swallowed by the din. The flood was climbing faster, the moon pulling it like a tide. Elias climbed, water sloshing behind him, the house settling into its annual surrender. But this time, he wondered if they'd all surface come morning, or if the water would claim what it had hungered for all these years. Elias gripped the splintered beam overhead, his arms burning as the water surged higher, lapping at his chest now. The harvest moon hung bloated outside the shattered window, its light fracturing through the ripples like shattered glass. Every year it came, this flood that wasn't just rain or river overflow, something older, hungrier, pulling the earth itself upward from the roots. The Drownsworth house, built on that cursed hollow by his grandfather, groaned under the weight, timbers creaking like old bones. "Pa, it's rising faster." Mary's voice cut sharp from the corner, where she clung to the ladder they'd lashed together from attic crates. At 14, she was all wiry strength and unyielding glare, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. She hauled on the rope tied to little Tom's waist, the boy dangling half-submerged below, his small hands scrabbling at the flooded floorboards. Elias twisted, spotting the dark shape circling beneath, not a log, not debris, but the thing that always came with the waters. Eyes like polished river stones gleamed up at them, patient. "Hold fast, girl. We get Tom up, then you." His voice stayed steady, though his heart hammered. They'd lost the mule last moon, and Aunt Clara before that, swept under without a scream. This time, he'd sworn it different. No running to the hilltop neighbors. The roads were gone, swallowed too. The house shuddered, a deep rumble from below, as if the foundation cracked wider. Water bubbled up through the seams, cold and thick with silt that clung like fingers. Elias's boots slipped on the slick beam, and he bit back a curse, swinging his free hand to grab a loose shingle. Tom's cries turned frantic, bubbles escaping his lips as the current tugged harder. Mary yanked the rope with both hands, veins standing out on her neck, but the knot at Tom's end frayed against the wood. "Can't hold," she gasped, feet sliding on the ladder's rungs. Elias dropped, plunging elbow-deep into the flood. His fingers brushed something slick, Tom's collar. He latched on, pulling with everything left, the boy's weight yanking him sideways. The shape below thrashed, a tail-fin slap sending waves crashing against the walls. Up Tom came, sputtering, eyes wide with terror, clutching Elias's shirt like a lifeline. They collapsed together on the beam, Tom heaving for air, Mary scrambling down to wrap him in her shawl. The water climbed another inch, the moon's glow turning the room to silver poison. Elias scanned the attic hatch above. Too far, the ladder too short now. The thing below circled closer, its silhouette longer, scales glinting. "We ain't climbing," he said, voice low. "We fight it here." He drew the iron poker from his belt, the one forged from the old well chain, its tip glowing faintly in the moonlight, the only thing that ever scarred the beast before. Mary nodded, prying a loose floorboard free, her hands steady despite the tremble in her legs. Tom buried his face in her side, but his small fist clenched around a shard of glass. The flood whispered promises of quiet below, but they held, a ragged line against the rising dark. Elias gripped the lantern's handle until his knuckles blanched, the flame inside flickering like a heartbeat against the relentless gurgle of water rising through the floorboards. The harvest moon hung bloated and orange outside the shattered parlor window, casting silvery ripples across the sodden rugs that clung to their ankles. Thomas waited beside him, his face smeared with mud, whispering curses under his breath as he tugged at the loose plank they'd pried up earlier that evening. "It's gotta be down here, Pa." The whispering, "It's louder now, ain't it?" Clara knelt a few paces away, her skirts heavy and plastered to her legs, one hand steadying Eliza, who trembled with her arms wrapped tight around a sodden family Bible. The girl's eyes darted to the corners where shadows pooled unnaturally deep, as if the house itself breathed in the damp. "Mama, what if it takes us like it did the others?" Eliza's voice cracked, small and sharp in the humid air. "Hush now," Clara murmured, though her own breath came quick. She pressed a palm to the wall, feeling the pulse of moisture seeping through the cracks, faster than before, like blood from a fresh wound. They'd come this far, tracing the flood's source to the cellar beneath the old well, armed with nothing but iron tools and the half-remembered tales from Elias's grandfather. The water wasn't natural. It carried echoes, faint voices that tugged at memories long buried. Last moon, it had claimed their neighbors' crop and livestock, leaving only whispers in the mist. This time, it hungered for the house itself for them. Thomas heaved the plank aside with a splintering crack, revealing a black maw below, the air rising cold and thick with the scent of earth and decay. "Look," he said, pointing his candle into the void. There, etched into the stone lining the well's mouth, were the marks, spiraling runes that seemed to writhe in the light, glowing faintly as the water lapped higher. Elias's stomach twisted. He'd seen them in his dreams, calling him down. "We fill it with the lime and salt, like the old man said. Seal it proper." But as Thomas leaned in to scatter the first handful of the coarse mixture, a low rumble echoed from the depths, vibrating through the floor like distant thunder. The water surged suddenly, not a trickle but a gush, slamming into Thomas's chest and knocking him back. He splashed down hard, gasping, the candle snuffed out in an instant. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by Elias's lantern and the moon's indifferent gleam. "Thomas!" Clara lunged forward, her fingers finding his arm in the murk, pulling him upright as the flood clawed at their knees. Eliza screamed, the sound raw and piercing, her Bible slipping into the rising tide. Elias swung the lantern wildly, its light catching glimpses of the runes pulsing brighter, as if feeding on the chaos. Something stirred below, a shape, long and sinuous, coiling through the water like smoke in a breeze. Not a beast, but a presence, ancient and insistent, whispering promises of release if they just let go. Elias dropped to his knees, scooping handfuls of the lime mixture despite the burn against his skin, hurling it into the well. It hissed on contact with the water, steam rising in acrid clouds that stung their eyes. Thomas coughed, joining him, their movements frantic, synchronized in desperation. Clara shielded Eliza, backing toward the stairs, but the water followed, climbing the walls in thin sheets, dripping from the ceiling like tears. "It's fighting back," Thomas rasped, his wit sharpened by fear into something fierce. "Keep going, it's weakening. I can feel it." The whispers grew louder, weaving through the steam, names, regrets, the weight of harvests lost and lives unclaimed. Elias's mind reeled, visions flashing of his father's drowned fields, his own hands empty year after year. But he pushed on, the lantern tipping precariously as another surge rocked the house. The floor buckled beneath them, a crack spiderwebbing toward the well's edge. Eliza clung to Clara, her caution fracturing into resolve. She snatched up a fallen shovel, thrusting it into the mixture and flinging it down with all her might. For a moment, the runes flared, blinding white, and the water receded. Just an inch, then two, revealing the stone's true age, cracked and weary. The presence recoiled, its coil tightening in retreat, but not without cost. A beam groaned overhead, splintering as the flood's pressure warped the timbers. Elias grabbed Thomas's collar, yanking him back as the ceiling sagged, plaster raining down in wet clumps. They scrambled for the stairs, the lanterns swinging wild, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters. Clara half-carried Eliza, her brave facade cracking with a sob as the whispers faded to a sullen murmur. The house shuddered once more, settling into an uneasy quiet, but the damage lingered. The parlor walls bowed inward, the well's mouth still gaping, hungry for the next moon. They emerged into the night air, sodden and shivering, the harvest moon watching impassively as the first hints of dawn bled the sky pink. Victory, but scarred. The flood had taken its toll on the foundation, and on them. The harvest moon hung low over the Missouri hills, its bloated light filtering through the cracked windows of the Drownsworth house like a sickly veil. Elias wiped the mud from his hands, the chill of the receding water still clinging to his skin, as if it refused to let go. The flood had come again, fiercer this time, swallowing the porch and lapping at the second-floor sills before the family had dragged what they could to higher ground. But this time, something had shifted in the depths, whispers from the river, carried on the current, that spoke of old debts unpaid. Lydia stood at the edge of the yard, her shawl pulled tight against the autumn wind, watching the waterline retreat into the creek bed. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned the debris, splintered beams from the barn, a child's forgotten doll half buried in silt, and the faint outline of tracks that didn't belong to man or beast. "It's not done with us," she murmured, her voice steady but laced with the weariness of too many moons. Beside her, young Thomas clutched the lantern, its flame flickering against the gathering dusk, his small frame tense from the night's labors. Elias joined them, his boots squelching in the muck. He'd spent the hour since dawn reinforcing the cellar door, hammering nails into warped wood while the river's roar mocked his efforts. The curse, or whatever it was, had started with his grandfather, tied to some forgotten bargain with the land, but Elias had always believed resolve could break it. Tonight, though, as the moon crested fully, he felt the pull in his bones, a tide that tugged at the edges of his sanity. "We move at first light," he said, forcing conviction into his words. "Pack only what's essential. The wagon's ready." Thomas looked up, his face pale under the lantern's glow. "But Pa, what if it follows? The house, it's all we got." The boy's voice cracked, not with fear alone, but with the dawning understanding that home was a fragile thing, eroded year by year. Lydia knelt beside him, brushing a streak of dirt from his cheek. "It won't be easy, love. But staying means losing more than walls." Her hand trembled slightly as she spoke, betraying the cost of her caution. The nights she'd lain awake, piecing together journals from the attic that hinted at rituals long abandoned. As the moon climbed higher, the air grew thick, the whispers rising from the damp earth like steam. Shadows lengthened unnaturally along the fence line, coiling around the roots of the old oak that had stood sentinel for generations. Elias felt it first, a pressure in his chest, as if the river sought to reclaim him through memory alone. He recalled the previous flood, when the water had risen without rain, pulling at their heels as they fled to the hillock. This time, it had nearly taken Thomas, the current snatching him under the floorboards until Lydia's quick hands hauled him free. They gathered inside what remained dry, the family huddled around a meager fire in the parlor. The walls wept rivulets of moisture, and the floorboards groaned under invisible weight. "We burn the root tomorrow," Elias declared, his voice low. The oak's roots intertwined with the foundation, fed by the same dark vein that summoned the floods. It was a desperate plan, born of exhaustion, but one they'd skirted for years. Lydia nodded, her wits surfacing in the tension. "Just don't go setting the whole county ablaze. We've enough troubles without the sheriff knocking." Thomas added kindling to the fire, his movements deliberate, brave in imitation of his father. But as midnight neared, the whispers intensified, forming words that slithered into their minds. Asterisk stay. Give what is owed. Asterisk the lantern sputtered, and for a moment, the room filled with the scent of brackish water, as if the flood hovered just beyond the threshold. Dawn broke gray and reluctant, the moon's influence waning but not gone. They worked in silence, axes biting into the oak's trunk under a sky heavy with unshed rain. Chips flew like accusations, each strike echoing the family's fractured resolve. When the tree finally toppled, crashing into the flooded yard with a thunderous splash, the ground shuddered. Water surged one last time, black and insistent, licking at their ankles before retreating into the earth, swallowed by the severed roots. The house stood scarred but intact, its sills scarred with high-water marks that told of survival's toll. Elias shouldered the axe, his hands blistered, while Lydia surveyed the damage, already calculating repairs. Thomas picked up the doll from the mud, its fabric ruined, and tucked it into his pocket, a small anchor against the uncertainty. The river flowed quieter now, its whispers faded to a murmur, but they knew the land held grudges. As they turned toward the wagon, the harvest moon dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a promise of uneasy peace and the weight of what they'd severed forever.